Ambassador, thank you for your welcome. It's a privilege to be here in this beautiful house and with so many historic associations. And I think when we get some drinks afterwards in the Winter Garden, we'll see some pictures of Churchill and Maisky at dinner here in the Second World War. It's a particular pleasure to, as it were, share the podium with Vladimir. I've known you for 20 years or so at various conferences in different places. That's been a great pleasure, and I also want to make it clear that although you spoke very generously about we and our book, this is very much a product of your work, you and your colleagues. My role has been partly to, as you say, expedite the study of the documents at Churchill College in Britain, and then also in the future to help produce or to lead in the production of an English language edition of this volume, these volumes, which will be a considerable project. Just to be clear, and you can look at this I'm sure afterwards, we're talking about 869 messages that were exchanged during the Second World War and immediately afterwards. That includes up to the end of 1945, just some messages with Ackley and Truman, the heart of this correspondence of Churchill-Roosevelt, Stalin. And each of those documents, or almost all of them, has been annotated so that we have an explanation of the background to these documents, an understanding of some of the deeper issues, the Second Front, Arctic convoys, Lend-Lease, so on, the international conferences that took place. And the documents are arranged in chapters, each of which has an introductory section contextualizing that part of the war. So it's possible to read this, almost to read it through just the chapter introductions and get a sense of the whole story. It's also possible to dip endlessly into the individual documents and get a flavour of the correspondence. And it's also, because it's beautifully illustrated, it's also possible to see not only pictures of some of the key people, but also facsimiles of some of the documents. And if I just hold this one up, you get an immediate sense of, as it were, the colour of particularly the Russian documentation, because what we have here is a foreign ministry draft on which Stalin has annotated, not just in blue pencil, but also around the corners in red. And this was a document we were talking about at lunch, in which Stalin, it's a message to Churchill in 1944 and later 1944, summer 1944, in which the V-bombs had started to drop on London. And Stalin adds some extra colour about what is the reaction of the British, and to congratulate the British on their fortitude in surviving this bombardment and so on. That's part of the fun of this documentation. What I think you get from it is a really powerful sense of how three leaders, each of these three leaders, tried to cultivate the other. This wasn't a formal exercise. Yes, they had material from their foreign ministry, from their advisors. Stalin, one of the wonders of this is the very meticulous sort of database that comes from the Russian foreign ministry and drafts from Molotov. But as this example I showed you shows, Stalin has his own take on this. He will say, send this bit to Roosevelt, send this bit to Churchill. He sees them as different kinds of human beings to be played on in different ways. Roosevelt also has his sense of how he is going to play this relationship. There's a wonderful message to Churchill in 1942, March 1942, where Roosevelt says, I hope you don't mind, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he says, I hope you don't mind, but I think I can deal with Stalin better than your Foreign Office or my State Department. He thinks he likes me best, and I hope to keep it that way. At this stage, Roosevelt has never met Stalin. So the hubris of this man to believe, yes, I can handle Stalin better than anybody else, professional diplomats, is fascinating, but of course it's very Roosevelt. That's how he understood diplomacy. It was all about personal relationships, just as it was in politics. Churchill is equally concerned about how to handle these relationships. You can see it in Kimball's correspondence, edited correspondence of the Churchill-Roosevelt thing, Roosevelt messages. Churchill really passionate to try and understand Roosevelt, equally so with Stalin. Both Churchill and Roosevelt, I think, are fascinated by Stalin because he is such an unusual figure, something that doesn't fit within their normal experience. So each of these men is trying to play the personal relationship, and that, I think, is part of what comes out of these documents. What's also interesting, I think, if you read the documents more carefully, apart from the personal flavour, is that no government comes out really well. If you take, say, the story of the Second Front, the discussions in 1942-43 about when the Allies were going to launch a Second Front and where they were going to do so, which of course was at the heart of some of the tensions in the relationship at this time. It's clear that Churchill and Roosevelt are playing Stalin along. They are telling him things, they are half-promising things that suggest that it's going to come very soon in France. And Stalin, by 1943, in a couple of messages, pins them down quite clinically on the way that they have appeared to promise something and then not delivered. So on that, I don't think that Churchill and Roosevelt look particularly good. Conversely, the way Stalin responds to the sudden information about the Katyn graves does not reflect well on Stalin. He comes out straight, coming out punching from his corner, denying this as a complete slander and so on. But so neither side is looking, you know, as perfect as they might wish to be. This is a relationship that in 1944 I think becomes much closer. I think for all the leaders there's a sense that finally when the Normandy landings happen, and also of course the great Red Army offensive of 1944, Bagration, which also occurs on the 22nd of June. This is the anniversary of that as well. Those two hammer blows on the Third Reich from west and east impart time to work with each other. Stalin certainly was working with Western allies over the timing and the planning of that offensive and the delivery of it. Those are critical moments in signaling the end of the Third Reich, and also I think encouraging a sense of mutual confidence. Stalin can certainly feel that his allies have finally delivered on their the Second Front. In 1945, relations worsen, yes. As the end of the war comes, and as the, if you like, the common cement of fighting Nazi Germany begins to erode. But nobody intends the Cold War. That, I think, is also clear from this correspondence. It surprises and in some ways disconcerts all of them. Churchill is sometimes quoted in January 1945 as saying, the only bond of the victors is their common hate. The only bond of the victors is their common hate. In other words, Nazi Germany is what holds us together. Martin Gilbert quotes that in his official biography of Churchill. What, for some reason, he doesn't do is continue with the next sentence. Having written, the only bond of the victors is their common hate, Churchill adds, we must think of something better than that. We must think of something better than that. In other words, there ought to be something positive as well as something negative that holds us together. And it's very striking that right to the end of his life, Churchill never really understands how the Cold War came about. He is genuinely puzzled by it, and his line right to the end is that when I talked to Stalin, we sorted things out. He says in January 1944, if Stalin and I could talk, have dinner every week, we would iron out these problems. Now there is of course a good deal of self-delusion there, but there is nevertheless a sense for Churchill that this outcome is not what he'd expected. He's known now as a Cold Warrior, he's known as the author of the so-called Iron Curtain speech, but Churchill, his own title for that speech, as you probably know, is The Sinews of Peace. The Sinews of Peace, and what makes peace hang together. And his line in that is one which I think any diplomat would recognise, that what we want is negotiation from a position of strength. All diplomats want to negotiate from a position of strength. But Churchill's message is not war, it's about negotiation. As I say, he does not anticipate the way the relationship breaks down. And similarly, we were talking about this at lunch, Stalin's aspirations in 1945 are towards getting reconstruction aid from the West, in talking about ways in which there might be engagement with some of the institutions that are emerging from World War II, economic institutions, participation in the Bretton Woods Conference, for example, obviously on his own terms and from the perspective of a Marxist-Leninist system, but again, not the breakdown that actually happened. So I think that what we're trying to do in this book, insofar as there is an agenda, is to show that, is to give a broader international history of a war that is often written about from our own national perspectives. I say our, I think the Americans, we can probably all agree, being British and Russians here, the Americans are even more nationalistic and parochial than we are. Their view of the war is even more specifically nationalistic. And I have an American wife, so I think I'm partly justified in saying that. But what this book, I think, does is to give a larger sense of the war and the perspectives of our three different countries, and to open up a sense of our experience, as Vladimir said, that is more than purely national. I just want to end with one last comment. Mention has been made by the ambassador, by Vladimir, of the earlier version of the Stalin correspondence with Churchill and Roosevelt, which was published in 1957. That was published by the Soviet Foreign Ministry. And although it was published as, in some ways, as a Cold War document, originally authorized by Stalin, though produced later on under Khrushchev and Gromyko, nevertheless, it is actually a very substantial and basically accurate rendition of the documents. In fact, when we were discussing how to handle this volume, we agreed to start from that as the base. So that was produced in 1957, partly in reaction to the way Churchill had used some of this documentation in his own war memoirs in a partial way. But it's interesting to reflect that in 1957, there was in this country no Public Records Act. There was no agreed procedure for the access to official British government documents. In 1958, British government started a 50-year rule, which would have meant that the documents were open up to from 1908 onwards. But when Churchill was writing his memoirs, when Stalin and Molotov and Gromyko and Khrushchev were thinking about this set of documents, it was a reasonable expectation that nobody would be, in Britain, would be reading the British material about the Second World War until the 21st century. So it is, I think, interesting that in this slightly counterintuitive way that we're trying to explore this war and the stereotypes behind it, it was on the point of opening up some of these documents. It was the Russians who started to open the Iron Curtain before the British. Thank you very much.